Good morning. How is everyone this morning? It's good to see everyone here. We are going to be in Genesis chapter 16 this morning. Have you ever found yourself stuck? Maybe not literally stuck, although sometimes we can get stuck, right? And maybe now it's pouring with rain again, we get stuck in the mud, right? Or stuck in traffic, or maybe even soon we'll get stuck in snow again. Who knows? But stuck in life. Have you ever found yourself stuck in life, in a place where you just didn't envision you'd end up, and you can't really go forwards, and you can't really go backwards either? Because the way forward just seems uncertain and really maybe not even promising. But to go back, well, that's who wants to go back, right? Because that can be painful and that can be difficult, and that would be to admit defeat. And maybe what you need is just someone to come alongside you and help you and point you in the right direction. I think last year we did a series in Philippians, and I talked a bit about running, and just going to talk a little bit more about my experiences this morning because, it just kind of relates to life quite well. I ran this 100-miler up near McCall, Idaho, which is kind of a rough place to be out in the middle of nowhere. And it was hard, and the terrain was hard, and there was scree all over the trail, so it's hard to get good footing. And there weren't many runners in this race either. There was only 30 or so runners in this race, and which I kind of like low-key races, to be honest. But the problem is, though, as you're spread out over the distance, you don't ever really come across anybody if there's not many people running, and especially a third drops out over the course of the race. There's even less left. And sometimes it's just nice to have some company to run with and a friendly face. And on top of that, this course was not very well marked either. And it took a couple of wrong turns, and the last thing you want to do is really add on extra miles when you're running that kind of distance, but there you are. And it was towards the end of the night, and I just made this climb up this mountain really, a couple of 1,000 feet up, and somehow they managed to get an aid station at the top of this hill, and so that was nice. And it was probably around the 70-mile mark or so, and I was just allowing my mind to think about actually finishing the race, because I never like to think about that too soon, right? But pretty much you just think about getting to that next aid station. That's the important question. And so how far is it to the next aid station? And the person there said, it's not very far, it's only about 5 miles or so, right? And it's downhill and then flat. And I was like, easy, I'm going to be in there in no time. We're going to knock this thing out. It's going to be great, right? And so off I went. And I was feeling kind of optimistic, and the real thick darkness was starting to grey a bit now, and it looked like it was going to be a beautiful day. And about an hour and a half later, as the sun was peeking up above the horizon, casting its first warmth across the landscape, my heart was sinking because I had not found this aid station. And by my reckoning, I'd done 7 or 8 miles now, and where was this aid station? And my mind was kind of full of doubt because I'd already gone wrong a couple of times, right? And maybe I missed a turn or something, though I didn't really think I had. And so I sat down on this rock in absolute despair. Because the thing about these ultras is, though it's physical, it is mental too. And after you've been up and 24 hours and running, and you just get mentally tired. And your mind can go into some dark, dark places. And that's where my mind descended into this kind of deep, dark low. I was really in the pit of despond. And the other thing was that this was the first race I'd managed to persuade my whole family to come to one of these things. And so I'd envisioned in my mind the finish line, right? And that my kids would be there, and I was going to make them proud, right? And so the more I thought about this, I didn't even know where I was, never mind let alone be able to finish. And also my goal of time was slipping away too. Have you ever had that happen to you in life? Maybe not on a running race or any other kind of race, but you're just going along in life and you think that you know where you are going, and then something happens and suddenly you're just not quite so sure anymore. Circumstances change. Relational shift or something, or work or health or finances, whatever it may be. And where to go now? Keep pushing forward, hope that it's just going to work out, or maybe backtrack, or do what? And maybe just sit down on that metaphorical rock, lost and alone. And what you need is someone who knows, for sure, to come along and help you find the way. Well, this morning we're going to read about a woman who found herself in that situation, not at a rock, but at a spring of water. She was lost, she was alone, and she was stuck. Genesis chapter 16, verse 1 through 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant your embrace, and when she saw that she conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." And Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She said, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." And the angel of the Lord said to her, "Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen." So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God of seeing." For she said, "Truly, here I have seen him who looks after me." Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So this story involves three people. Well, four if you include God, of course. Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. And actually the story is not really about Hagar, is it? It's primarily about Abram and Sarai. And it had begun 10 years before when God had appeared to Abram and told Abram to leave his home in Haran and go to a land that God was going to show him. In fact, God not only did that, but he gave Abram this incredible promise, right? "I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And Abram set off with Sarai and his nephew Lot, and he had possessions and servants. He was already a wealthy man, right? And he packed it all up, and off he went to the land of Canaan. And they were in Canaan, and then this famine came along, and he decided, better go to Egypt, right? Because there's probably food down there. And so he went down to Egypt, and when he got to Egypt, he told Sarai, his wife, hey, if they think that you're my wife, they might try to top me so that some bloke can have you. And so just pretend to be my sister, right? And so Sarai did that, and Pharaoh decided that he would take her into his house because he didn't know she was Abram's wife. Of course, some plagues came along onto Pharaoh's household, and he kind of sussed it all out that actually Sarai was Abram's wife. And why do you do this to me? Why didn't you just be upfront and honest to start with? And really, why didn't Abram just be upfront and honest to start with? Why didn't he trust God for God's protection? One of the things that I love about Abram's story is that he is this great figure of faith, isn't he? He's called a friend of God, and yet his journey of faith is like, some tremendous highs and then some tremendous lows there too, right? And I don't know about you, but that gives me such hope for myself. It's like, because my journey of faith is not, it is like, and then down and up and down, and yet hopefully all the time it is kind of going up. Anyway, Pharaoh sends them all away quickly, doesn't he? And the thing about the Bible is we have to keep seeing these repeating stories, because this is really getting us ready, isn't it? For hundreds of years down the line, when who's going to go to Egypt? Joseph. And the rest of Abram's descendants are going to go to Egypt as well. And they're going to stay there for 400 years, right? And then what's going to happen? Some plagues are going to come along. And what's Pharaoh going to do? Send them out of Egypt. And Abram goes back to the land of Canaan, and his nephew Lot splits from him and decides to go and live in Sodom. That's not a good decision, because eventually Lot gets captured by a marauding army. But fortunately for him, his uncle goes and conducts some guerrilla warfare and gets him back and stuff back. And that's kind of the backstory, right? And it seems like it's all just going swimmingly well for Abram. Except there's a big but, isn't there? Because shouldn't God have given them a child by now? God's promise depends on them having an heir. It depends on them having a son, and they don't have one. They're childless. They're stuck, right? God has given them this incredible finish line that he's promised them, but how are they going to reach it? Bless you. How are they going to get there? We're in this series, and it's called God Questions. And God asks two questions in this text. Not actually to Abram or to Sarai, but to Hagar, who gets caught up in Abram's and Sarai's plan to get to the finish line. And the question that God asks Hagar is about her journey. And they are questions that God asks us this morning about our journey too. And really there are only two questions worth answering. And the first question concerns our departure point. Where have you come from? Asked the Lord. Sometimes my wife Leslie and I, we have differing views on things. Just imagine that. And one of the things that we have differing views on is if we've been on a trip or away for a little bit and you come back and you look in the fridge and she looks at expiration dates, right, to see if stuff's out of date. And if anything is like near that date, boof, in the bin it goes, right? Me, I'm not like that. It's like, well, I actually look at the food and smell it and maybe even taste it to see if it can be eaten or not. And I don't really look at the date. Anyway, I read this article the other day. And it came down on my side because it said that expiration dates are actually not very meaningful, generally speaking. In fact, a lot of them just say like best used by or sell by or best before, which means what, you know. And these researchers went and did some dumpster diving, and they found that 68% of the food that we bin is actually still edible. 68%. But some things do expire. I do recognize that, right? You know, a few years ago I cleaned out my mum and dad's flat after they died, and they had some jars and tins and stuff in there that were like, yeah. That was definitely expired. Hagar's departure point starts with an expiration date. Not hers, but Sarai's, right? She's old. She's postmenopausal. Actually, that doesn't really matter because even premenopausal, she still wasn't able to conceive and have a child. And we need to understand that in this culture, that having children was not some kind of lifestyle option. It was essential. It was a wife's mission. It was her what she was all about, to have kids, and especially a male child to provide an heir for the family. And this was even more important in light of God's promise, right? Because how is God's promise going to be fulfilled if there's no male child? In fact, just in the previous chapter 15, God had reiterated to Abram that was his promise, that Eliezer of Damascus, his servant, was not going to be his heir, that a child was going to be his heir, his very own son. But how is that going to happen if Sarai cannot have kids? Well, perhaps, though, she could. Perhaps she could fulfill God's promise because she had this Egyptian servant called Hagar. And without going too much into the depths of the customs of the time, it was possible for a wife to give her servant to her husband in order to have like a surrogate child, if you like. And that's what Sarai does. She gives Hagar to her husband. After all, Hagar is her servant. She is her property, and that's what she can do. You know, in this text, if you notice that neither Abram nor Sarai ever mention Hagar by name. Not once. She's just a means to an end. And nowhere in the Bible does God condone this. In fact, it really goes against Genesis chapter 1, doesn't it? Where a man and a woman shall cleave together and become husband and wife, one flesh. Because the Bible stands for the dignity of every single human being. We are all made in the image of God. We are not a means to somebody else's end. Nobody is. But nonetheless, Sarai has this plan, and she puts it to Abram, and he agrees, right? And again, we need to think back, and here's shades of Genesis chapter 3, right, coming in, and the fall and the temptation. And of course, Hagar goes with Abram, and in contrast to Sarai, she has no problem getting pregnant whatsoever, right? It's the success. Now, Sarai's plan has succeeded. Everything that she hoped would happen has happened. She's going to fulfill God's promise herself. You ever tried to fulfill God's promise yourself? You thought, oh, I can do that. I can just hasten God's plan along with my own help. And then somewhere along the trail there, to her being a mother, she hits this kind of unexpected snag, doesn't she? Because she's expecting to feel joy and wonder and expectation, but instead what she feels is anger and jealousy and bitterness and resentment and hurt. And she goes into a dark place. Because as Hagar's baby bump begins to grow, apparently so does Hagar's attitude. And she looks and treats her mistress with contempt. Because she has what Sarai, for, I don't know, how about 70-some years, has longed to have. And that is her husband's baby. Now, we don't know really whether this contempt was real or whether it was just perceived. But when Sarai concocted her plan, she never really thought through this emotional part, did she? She never thought about how it was going to be for her watching this servant girl of hers have her husband's baby grow inside of her. Does she even want to go forward now with this plan? Well, it's a bit late, isn't it? Because she can't go back now. The damage is done, so to speak. And so she complains to Abram that, look what you've done to me. It's like, isn't that funny, right? When we have plans that don't really work out, well, we'll just blame somebody else, right? Look what you have done to me. We take all the credit when our plans are going well, but when they don't go well, we just blame somebody else. Again, we have shades of Genesis chapter 3 here too, don't we? Like Adam blaming God and Eve blaming, God and the snake rather. And it's all Abram's fault, right? And she even calls for God's judgment between the two of them. But Abram just meekly tells Sarai, well, she's your servant. You can do with her as she wishes. K.A. Matthews in his commentary says, if Hagar shows some pride and if Sarai shows a false blame, Abram demonstrates a false neutrality. He too, like Sarai, does not refer to Hagar by name, but only a label. In fact, things get so bad for Hagar, don't they, that she feels like she has to do a runner in order to stay safe. She legs it off from Sarai and she flees for her life. And so she runs until she's exhausted and she crumples by this spring. And then the voice of the Lord comes to her. Where have you come from? Where have you come? And notice that the Lord calls Hagar by name. Hagar, where have you come from? What is your departure point? So I want you right now to insert your own name in there and the Lord saying to you, where have you come from this morning? Where have you come from? What is your departure point? Because we all have one, don't we? Every one of us has a departure point this morning, and something has driven us to where we are this morning. What is that? Is that fear? Is that a plan? What has driven us to this place that we are at this morning? Because it is really important for us to understand our departure point because it shows us where we are, right? Where we have come from. Most of us, fortunately, aren't really in a situation like Hagar. But maybe this morning you do feel like a label, that you're just a number, a faceless means for something else around you. In fact, the less you have, the more likely you are to feel that, right? Without a voice, manipulated. Because our sympathies really, when we think about this story, don't they? They lie with Hagar. And yet even Sarai is a victim too, isn't she? I mean, she has this tremendous pressure on her to produce a son and an heir for Abram. In fact, we're all kind of caught up in this stuff, aren't we? Our departure point. Pressure placed on us. We have plans that we're enacting to try and get us across the finish line of life, wherever that may or may not be. And as we look around and we see other people around us, we don't know their departure points either, do we? Just like we didn't know Hagar or Sarai unless we'd been told. And we make assumptions about where people have come from. Based on what? Because half the time we never bother to ask, do we? Where have you come from? And if we ask, we don't bother to listen either. Do we actually care enough to find out? As I was sitting on my rock of despond, I don't even remember how long I sat there. It seemed like a long, long time. But then I heard the sound of some voices and running feet, right? And a couple of runners came along and, "Oh, are you okay?" and so I kind of explained the situation, and they said, "Yeah, they told us that too." And so we kind of reviewed where we'd come from, right? How we had got to where we are. And it was good because there was three of us, and we were able to go, well, I don't see any other trails going off anywhere. We have to be on the right trail still. How did I get there? It's good, right, to review where we have come from. But sometimes that can be hard. Sometimes that can be difficult. Sometimes we don't actually want to go back and have a little look to see what our departure point is. Jesus one time was traveling back to Galilee from Judea. And for some reason he went through Samaria, which was kind of strange because Jews didn't like to go through Samaria because they didn't like the Samaritans, and the Samaritans mutually didn't like the Jews very much. But it was about midday and he was tired and he sat down by this well, and his disciples went off to the nearest subway or whatever it was to find lunch. And along came this woman to draw water from the well, which was kind of an odd time of day for a woman to come, because usually you would come in the cool of the day to do like hard manual work like that, the morning or the evening. So something's like not right about her. And Jesus, instead of ignoring her, instead of making a judgment about her and her departure point, instead of just sticking a label on her, he asks her for a drink of water. Maybe he even used her name. I don't know. The text doesn't say. But she is kind of taken aback, isn't she? Because she asks, well, number one, how is it that you, a man, and number two, you, a Jewish man, and me, a Samaritan woman, are asking me for a drink? And Jesus said, well, if you'd known who was asking you for a drink, you would have asked for living water, because that's what I have on offer for you this morning, this day. And she's like, well, yeah, but this well's pretty deep, and you don't have a bucket and a rope, so exactly how do you think you're going to get this living water for me? You just don't have the means to do that. Jesus says, well, if you drink water out of this well, you're going to be thirsty again. But the water that I have to give you, you will never be thirsty. In fact, it's going to be like a spring inside of you, welling up into eternal life. And the woman thinks, that sounds handy. I won't have to come to this well again. Well, maybe you could give me some of that water. But before Jesus can give her that water, he has to take her back to her departure point, doesn't he? How did she get to this place where she's coming at midday to this well? Go and call your husband, Jesus tells her. And the woman says, well, actually, I don't have a husband. Which was true to a point. Because Jesus says, well, you're right. The chap you're living with right now is not your husband, and you've had 5 husbands, haven't you? See what Jesus is doing? He's taking her back to her departure point. He wants her to review how she got from there to where she is now. And we don't know, do we? That's between her and Jesus, right? I don't know if she was the victim of bad luck, if she was the victim of abuse, Perhaps she's caused some of it. We don't know. Maybe, like Hagar, she started off life with hopes and dreams, right? Like we all do, right? Hopefully that is our departure point, and yet something somewhere along the trail of life doesn't go the way we thought it would. And it takes God to draw us back, to open us up, because it's really impossible for us to move forward until we understand that departure point. That's why the psalmist cries out, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way of everlasting." Where have you come from this morning? Which leads to the second question. What is your destination? Where are you going? Where was Hagar going? Well, it's possible that she was going back to Egypt. What did she expect to find in Egypt? I mean, she presumably had been a slave in Egypt too, right? I don't know. Did she have family there? We don't know, right? Bless you. But sometimes, like, when the pressure's on us, we just want to go back to whatever it is that we know, even if it wasn't very good, right? Like when the Hebrews were taken out of slavery and bondage from Egypt, and suddenly they found themselves in the wilderness, and having to rely on God, and the kind of pressure is on. Oh, well, let's go back to Egypt. Forgetting how bad it was in Egypt. Often destinations are driven by our departure point, aren't they? That they drive us back to where we kind of came from. We all have destinations in mind in our lives, but where are they and what drives us to them? And often what drives us, we don't even realize it. We're part of a story that we don't even know that we're in. We don't even think about it, right? We just find ourselves into the story. Either we're forced into it or we've just accepted it without any real analysis. And off we go down the trail of life. That's just the way that life is lived. And sometimes it can take a crisis, right, to stop us in our tracks before we actually kind of stop and think about where it is that we're heading. A lot of you way too young right now, but there is a thing called midlife crisis. And there's a reason for that. Because suddenly you reach a point in life and you go, wait a sec, where are we going? Where am I going? Because you start to begin to see some of the destination that you've been sold in this world is like, what? What is the point of all this? What is the meaning behind all this? There's a woman, Elizabeth Edwards, and she was married to a guy who was running to be president. Actually, I can't remember obviously he was Edwards, but anyway, he set himself out to be this candidate, the family man candidate kind of thing, virtuous. And anyway, it turned out he was not. He was having an affair, and he had a child out of, with the woman he was having an affair with. And she was fighting cancer at the time too, which made it, doubly worse. And she said, I thought I was in one story, and it turns out I was in another. Hagar thought she was in one story, and it turned out she was in another. Isn't that the way for so many of us? We thought we were in one story, and it turns out that we're in another. The woman at the well became kind of uncomfortable about Jesus' questions, right? And she kind of switches the thing around, She says, "Oh, I see you are a prophet." I often wonder how she said that exactly, whether she was being sarcastic or genuine or whatever it was. But she says, well, speaking of prophecy things, what is the right place for worship? Because you Jews say that Jerusalem is the right place to worship, but we say, this Mount Gerizim, so which is it? And Jesus says, well, Jerusalem was the right place for worship. But the Father is looking for people to worship in spirit and truth. Ah, yes, says the woman. When the Messiah comes, he will show us the right destination. And then Jesus, in one of the most remarkable revelations that he actually makes to anybody, tells her, this nobody woman who was just a label, I who speak to you am he. And suddenly, this woman, not only does she have a new departure point, she has a new destination. And you know what? They're all kind of wrapped up in one. She doesn't have not looking for a past, not for a place, but she's looking to find her destination in Jesus Christ. Hagar is met by the angel of the Lord. And without spending the next hour talking about whether that's the pre-incarnate Christ or not, it is, I think, a full representation of God. And it is God who is speaking to Hagar. It is God who is revealing himself to this Egyptian slave who other people see just as a label. And he reveals to Hagar that she is going to have a son. She didn't know that before God met her. He's not going to be the son of promise, but he will have a legacy, although the legacy is going to be kind of on the fringes. And she's to call his name Ishmael, God hears. She is the first woman that God gives a birth announcement to. This Hagar, this woman, just a label. And she calls the name of the Lord Ata El Roi. You are the God of seeing, or you are the God who sees me. Because not only has God seen her, but she has seen him too, and she's heard God speak too. The God of the universe has heard her, seen her, given her a new departure point and a new destination. These two women have been met by God, seen and heard by him, and surely they now have this incredible, wonderful destination, right? And the Samaritan woman goes running off back into her village and telling everybody, come see a man who's told me everything I ever did in my life. Can he be the Messiah? And yet a few days later, though, Jesus leaves, doesn't he? But the Samaritan woman doesn't go with him. She's still there living life in this village. She still has a domestic situation to sort out. She still has to get water from the well. She still has to go on, doesn't she? People still knew her and people still labeled her. The angel of the Lord sends Hagar back to Sarai. And you go, wait, what? What? How can he do that? How can he send her back to this kind of abusive situation, right? And I'm not saying, and this passage does not say, that you should return to an abusive relationship or situation. If you're in danger, you should get out, and you should stay out, period. That's not what this passage is saying, nor is it talking about slavery or anything to do with that. That's an evil, evil institution. But we're talking about a specific individual that God has talked to here, that he is sending her back to Abram's house. Because also, we have to remember that Abram's house, right, is what? Blessed. It is a place of blessing. And God often does lead us on to new destinations, doesn't he? He'll meet us as a place, and he'll lead us to a new destination. But sometimes God doesn't do that, does he? Sometimes God gives us the pointers to go back from a place that we've left, and we go, well, I don't really want to go back there, Lord. And God is like, well, you've got some unfinished business there, Bryan. You need to go back. You need to take care of whatever it is that you need to take care of. You can't just keep running away. You need to go back. And God does that. Or maybe God has something more for us to do by going back. I always think of, when Jesus, he cast demons out of this man and into these pigs, and they all ran off the cliff into the sea. And the townspeople round about, they were pretty upset about the loss of pigs, and they actually asked Jesus to leave. And the chap who was demon-possessed, he didn't really want to stay there because they chained him up prior to that. And frankly, he didn't want to be with them. He wanted to go and be with Jesus. But Jesus said, no. You need to stay here. In fact, you need to go and tell people what God has done for you. And what the man did is he went around and told people what Jesus had done for him. Because we have to remember Jesus' destination in the midst of all this too, don't we? Peter made this tremendous profession of faith. Finally, they understood, Jesus' disciples, they understood Jesus' departure point, that he really was the Son of God, that he really had come from heaven to earth. And then Jesus reveals to them his destination, doesn't he? And Peter's going, no chance, Jesus. There's not a chance I'm going to let you go to Jerusalem and do that. And Jesus tells Peter, get behind me, Satan. Ouch. He says, you've got your eyes fixed on the destination of the world, not on the destination of God's kingdom. And then Jesus told his disciples that if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Because you see, our destination becomes wrapped up in Jesus' destination. And Jesus' destination was the cross to pay for our departure points. And through that, he gives us this new destination, right? That we die to our previous departure point, but we are raised again through his resurrection to new life. And that is what we have to keep in mind always. And especially when we don't get to where we want to get at the moment. It means picking up our cross and following Jesus. Well, I got off my rock, and the three of us, we ran, and that actual next aid station wasn't that far down the trail. It was only about a mile away. Yeah, that's what I said, Wes. Or at least words to that effect. Sometimes we need someone, don't we? Just to correctly help us see where we've come from and see where we are going. Because unless that person is Jesus Christ, we actually can't really see where we've come from, and we can never see where we are going. And that's what Jesus does for us.